As the world barrels towards multiple economic, social, environmental, and geostrategic crises, the atomic clock remains at 90 seconds to midnight.
I wanna start a revolution.
All right, guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. I know it's been a long time since you guys have seen me in the studio, and I know it's been a long time since I put out some new content, but we're back in the studio here trying to get that muscle memory going again. So bear with me if this video is a little shorter, or maybe if it's not some of my best work. This video is really about, trying to flex those muscles again in making content so I can hopefully get into a new routine, start doing this more for you guys again. I've said in past episodes, I've had a lot of life challenges and new things going on, and I am trying to fit this back into my life in a healthy way where I'm maybe not getting as burned out, especially with how drastic a lot of the news cycle has been the last really couple of years, right? So jumping into this video, we're going to be looking at a couple of articles from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We're going to be talking about how the Doomsday Clock in 2024 is still set 90 seconds to midnight. That is the closest to midnight it has ever been. We're going to be talking about the reasons, why that is, namely a lot of geopolitical tensions around the world. Obviously, Israel, Iran, tensions in the South China Sea with Taiwan, China, and the U.S. imperialism there, and obviously perhaps the biggest factor is the continuing escalation of the multi-year war in Ukraine, right, that has pit two nuclear superpowers, the U.S. and Russia, against each other and put them at a hair trigger's edge, right? So we'll go ahead and jump into the article here, guys. Like I said, we're going to be reading from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It says here, a moment of historic danger. It is still 90 seconds to midnight. 2024 Doomsday Clock statement. As you can see, this is from January 23rd, 2024. So yes, it is dated. But if you weren't aware, the Board of Atomic Scientists only updates the clock usually every year, right? For those of you who don't know what the Board of Atomic Scientists is, there's a little description here that I thought would be valuable. I'm assuming most of you who watch this channel are going to understand what the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is, but I know there's some that kind of just casually watch the show for little political updates because they like my personality or whatever it is, right? It says here, founded in 1945 by Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and University of Chicago scientists who helped develop the first atomic weapons in the Manhattan Project, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists created the Doomsday Clock 2 years later, using the imagery of apocalypse being midnight and the contemporary idiom of nuclear explosion, countdown to zero, to convey threats to humanity and the planet. The Doomsday Clock is set every year by the Bulletin Science and Security Board in consultation with its board of sponsors, which includes 9 Nobel laureates. The clock has become a universally recognized indicator of the world's vulnerability to global catastrophe caused by man-made technologies. So even if you're not really into politics, if you are engaged at all with popular culture, I'm sure you have seen the Doomsday Clock, right? It's usually, they'll wheel it out and they'll make this big announcement. It's a very, if you saw the thumbnail, that's the great example of what it is. It's this very plain, usually black and white clock with the hour set to midnight and then the minute hand, signifying where we are close to the end of all humanity, to the end times, to the literal doomsday, the literal apocalypse, right? Very powerful symbol. It's been with us for a long time. And as we'll see, the Doomsday Clock, it generally, as it says, came about from Albert Einstein, Robert Oppenheimer, who were the developers of both the theory and the material application of nuclear fission that allowed for atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, right? Which is a weapon that is so powerful, it has the ability, the capacity to eradicate not just all of human civilization, but some theorize all life on Earth, right? And so these scientists got together to, create the Doomsday Clock, to create the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, to elaborate, to make clear to people just how dangerous this is and how dangerous political tensions between superpowers can be as a result of this technology, right? So we'll go ahead and jump in here, guys. The article is broken down into several sections. We will be focusing mainly on the geostrategic tensions between Russia and the United States and how that is putting us closer to nuclear catastrophe, which is why I believe the main reason why we are at 90 seconds to midnight instead of like perhaps several minutes to midnight or something like that, right? So we'll be focusing on that. We'll be having more of a discussion about that, but we will also touch on some of these other technologies that really show us the sort of, not to be cynical, but bleak future we seem to be heading towards as a species, right? So going into this here, it says, China, Russia, it says, a moment of historic danger. It is still 90 seconds to midnight. China, Russia, and the United States are all spending huge sums to expand or modernize their nuclear arsenals, adding to the ever-present danger of nuclear war through mistake or miscalculation. In 2023, Earth experienced its hottest year on record, and massive floods, wildfires, and other climate-related disasters affected millions of people around the world. Meanwhile, rapid and worrisome developments in the life sciences and other disruptive technologies accelerated, while governments made only feeble efforts to control them. The members of the Science and Security Board have been deeply worried about the deteriorating state of the world. That is why we set the Doomsday Clock at 2 minutes to midnight in 2019 and at 100 seconds to midnight in 2022. Last year, we expressed our heightened concern by moving the clock to 90 seconds to midnight. The closest, I want to say that again, the closest to global catastrophe it has ever been, in large part because of Russian threats to use nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. So, if I was going to make any point in this video, and you don't have time and you just want to hear the main point, that is the point. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Doomsday Clock, has been around for about, 80 years now? 70, 80 years now. They are saying, by setting it to 90 seconds to midnight, that humankind is the closest to nuclear annihilation, to total civilizational collapse, to the end days. To literally, if we have, in the case of a nuclear war, the absolute Armageddon, the end of time. We are closer to that than at any other point in the history of the human species. And that is a result, by and large, of the war in Ukraine. And in particular, obviously here in the article, it says, in large part because of Russian threats to use nuclear weapons in the war of Ukraine. This is generally considered a Western organization, so take that with a grain of salt. We will have a discussion a little further into the video as to why it is not fair to put all of the blame on Russia. And as we've talked about many times from many different angles on this channel, we could argue that the United States is the cause of the war in Ukraine, is the reason why it continues to escalate, is the reason why we have not found a ceasefire or a demilitarized state or a peace agreement. Okay, so just clarifying that it's not accurate to put all the blame onto Russia. So let's jump back into the article here. More about the nuclear threat. Says the many dimensions of nuclear threat. A durable end to Russia's war in Ukraine seems distant, and the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in that conflict remains a serious possibility. In February 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced his decision to suspend the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START. In March, he announced the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. In June, Sergei Karaganov, an advisor to Putin, urged Moscow to consider launching limited nuclear strikes on Western Europe as a way to bring the war in Ukraine to a favorable conclusion. In October, Russia's Duma voted to withdraw Moscow's ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, as the U.S. Senate continued to refuse even to debate the ratification. So on that ending note there, I'll just point out kudos to the Bulletin here. At least they did note that while Russia's Duma voted to withdraw from it as a result of the continued escalation in Ukraine, keynote there is the U.S. Senate has refused to even debate it. And we actually did a video about weapons of mass destruction. I guess that would have been a couple of years ago, where we talked about, the U.S. historically, be it in working with native tribes in the Americas, dealing with other great powers or strategic rivals in any region of the world. The U.S. has literally backed out or cheated on or done some sort of rigmarole about every treaty it's ever been involved in. The biggest case in point is obviously look at how many treaties the U.S. has signed with the Native Americans and how many of them have been honored, right? As soon as it is no longer beneficial, the U.S. no longer honors them. So, good point there that while the Russia's Duma, which is like their Congress, their parliament, voted to withdraw the ratification of the CNTB, the U.S. has refused to even debate it. And alongside that, whenever we read Western media, we always hear about how Russia has done this, it's placing weapons here, it's responding with this. But every single time, the Western media, with some rare exclusions of certain NGO organizations or more independent media, blames every escalation on Russia. But if you actually look and analyze the sequence of events that have been happening in this war, every escalation Russia has made has been a result of NATO's escalation, right? Case in point is we talk here about Putin deciding to remove from the START Treaty, which is a treaty focused on trying to limit the development or the expanding of nuclear arsenals. The reason why he did that is, one, the U.S. has already stated at the beginning of this year or the end of last year that it has no intention of trying to further that or renegotiate that treaty as it comes to an end in a couple of years in 2026. Anyway, so it would make sense for Putin to do this because it seems like it's going to come to an end already. And as we know, the U.S. is already making military geostrategic moves with its nuclear arsenal, with other weapons. Obviously, we've heard of ATACMS missiles being used in Russia and things like that. So it makes sense for, if this is going to come to an end anyways, we might as well leave it, especially given all the treaties that the U.S. has left. So why don't we just do it now? So maybe we can have that 6 months to a year to 2 years of time to start mobilizing the creation of new weapons and put us on par with our adversaries, right? But talking about leaving treaties, I have a little list here of treaties the U.S. has left since the end of the Soviet Union. Sorry, guys. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the U.S. has used its unipolarity, its hegemony over the planet, to back out of essentially all arms control treaties. And that's not just with nuclear weapons. We've done, like I said, past video about them pulling out biological weapons mandates and things like that as well. So the U.S. has, under Bush, left the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and then more recently under Trump has left the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It has ripped up the Iran nuclear deal under Trump as well. And then they go ahead and they blame that on the Iranians of, like, they're continuing to enrich uranium. Meanwhile, the U.S. was never honoring the agreement even under Obama. And then it puts the blame on Iran to, deter responsibility, obviously. And then more recently as well, the Open Skies Treaty. So there is about 4 or 5 treaties that the U.S. government has backed out of in the last 20 years. And if you look into it, there's quite a bit more. Those are the bigger ones because they involve, nuclear proliferation. And then we get, the one thing that's pointed out in this is that Russia has left the START treaty. The other thing I want to point out here is this part where it says, in June, Sergei Karaganov, an advisor to Putin, urged Moscow to consider launching limited nuclear strikes on Western Europe. So that is not true. When they did talk about using nuclear weapons, but my understanding from reading from multiple sources was they talked about doing a nuclear test. The point Sergei was making was not that we are going to do strikes on Western cities in Western Europe or military installations in Western Europe. The point that he was making was, if I remember pretty close to the actual quote they said, is we need to make them fear the bomb again. And what he was talking about is like maybe we should have a highly publicized detonation of a weapon, like a weapons test, so that people can, for the first time in, I think, since the banning of nuclear testing under Kennedy, see a nuclear explosion in, literally caught in 4K, as a reminder to NATO, to the Western powers of, you keep escalating, despite us trying to have a limited operation in Ukraine to protect our interests, to maintain our national security, and that's a debate for another time, obviously. But you keep escalating. This is what you're escalating towards, right? So anyway, guys, there's a little bit more information on that. As usual, in the world, the U.S. is the number one threat to peace. And if you want more justification, more analysis as to why I feel, despite obviously clearly Russia being the quote-unquote aggressor with the start of the war in 22, the situation was created as a result of the U.S. Pentagon, U.S. politicians, and the U.S. national security state, right? And you can go back and watch some older videos where we do analysis on that. There's analysis all over that, all over the internet, from experts literally across the political spectrum, right wing, left wing, doesn't matter. Plenty of it. I mean, Henry Kissinger said that it's essentially the fault of the U.S. as well. Not that I want to quote that bastard. But at this point, if you are still acting like Russia is the primary cause of this conflict, you're being willful in your ignorance. Anyways, I'm rambling here, guys. Thinking out loud, obviously. Meanwhile, other potential nuclear crises fester. Iran continues to enrich uranium to close to weapons grade while stonewalling the International Atomic Energy Agency on key issues. Again, Iran, just noting here quickly before we move on, Iran was honoring all aspects of the agreement. Every single one. During that time, after the treaty was ratified and then was beginning to be implemented, the U.S. government was dicking around and fucking around and doing all this stupid bullshit as to why it couldn't keep up its hold of the bargain, which was pretty much the Iran. Here's the gist of the Iran deal, if you don't understand. Iran agreed to not enrich uranium to make nuclear weapons if, in exchange, the U.S. government would remove all the sanctions on its economy so that it could integrate into the global economy. Because sanctions are not only devastating to the economy, they're deadly for citizens within a society, right? And it worked like this. Okay, Iran, we will start de-escalating the enrichment of uranium, and while, by percentages, and while we're doing that by percentages, you will also decrease sanctions on our economy by percentages. So it's like, okay, we decrease 10%. Okay, 10% of sanctions are removed. Okay, we decrease another, so it worked like that. During that whole process, Iran was honoring its side of the agreement, and the U.S. was making excuses and doing all sorts of political cover to make sure it didn't have to honor its agreement. And then Trump gets in, rips it up. I mean, just rips it up. And then if you want to blame Trump for that, yeah, Trump was terrible. But Biden, just like with a lot of other foreign policy aspects, like the embargo on Cuba, is just as complicit or in bed with these sorts of foreign policy moves, because he could have done something to reapply that. Like, all the framework of that treaty already exists. He could have, it wouldn't have been a bunch of debating and back and forthing and a huge political statement or a political process necessarily to re-implement the deal, because you don't have to write it all over again. It's already written. You might have to do some tweaking and have, yes, a few meetings and some man hours put in, but it would have been fairly easy to re-implement that. So Biden didn't do that either. So again, it points the finger at Iran here because, again, this is a Western organization, but Iran is not to blame for this. So moving on here, guys. Efforts to reinstate an Iran nuclear deal appear unlikely to succeed. Okay, yeah, because the U.S. has done nothing to do it. And one last thing I'll point out, despite the fact that the U.S. has done nothing to re-implement it, Iran has been pretty prudent and responsible in its nuclear program in that it has not ferociously pursued the necessary amount of enriched nuclear materials necessary to make weapons. Because I think there's a debate going on in the ruling classes of Iran saying, like, yes, part of us want this as a deterrent to the United States, to the Gulf Arab monarchies, to Israel. It's probably the biggest one, right? But they also are the Iranian regime there are good statesmen. Say what you want about the regime and its different perspectives. I'm obviously no radical Islamist. I disagree fundamentally with that sort of theocratic ideology. But the Iranians are good statesmen. They have a lot of experience, and they consider things. They are responsible people, and they realize if we do achieve a nuclear weapon, that can be destabilizing for the region as a whole. Because then maybe other powers in the region will want nuclear weapons. Maybe the U.S. will then have a justification to give nuclear weapons. And while we can respect and understand the reason why countries want to have nuclear weapons as a deterrent, especially considering the most powerful capitalist imperialist nations in the world have huge nuclear arsenals, we understand why they want them. They also understand that more nuclear weapons in the world is dangerous because geopolitical tensions happen, mistakes happen. So, and that's a pretty big mistake. Nuclear holocaust. Yeah. North Korea continues building nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Nuclear expansion in Pakistan and India continues without pause or restraint. And the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas has the potential to escalate into a wider Middle Eastern conflict that could pose unpredictable threats regionally and globally. This article doesn't really touch on China, the U.S., Taiwan, in the South China Sea, the tensions there. I want to add to this with the United States military, Pentagon's first island chain strategy of containment, a lot of words there, in the Pacific, right? It's this idea that we're going to use Japan, the Philippines, all these other little islands that kind of rim. Here's like China, I don't know why I'm doing this with my hands. It's not going to help. Should pull up a map. But these island nations and regions that kind of rim the area of China, Korea, Vietnam, things like that, in conjunction with Vietnam, they want to place missile silos and military installations there, all that, good hardware to contain China. And that is obviously what Taiwan is about. They want to turn, as military officials have, U.S. military officials have said, turn Taiwan into a porcupine, right? A unsinkable aircraft carrier like Israel is for the U.S. in the Middle East and West Asia. Now, the tensions are sort of flatlined there right now because the U.S. is embroiled in the war in Ukraine and the potential of the Israeli genocide on Palestine spiraling out of control into a wider conflict there. So the tensions are sort of somewhat flatlined there, but it is a huge point of tension, especially as the U.S. continues to amp up its policy of quote-unquote containment in that region. So I'm saying all this, going on and on to say all this. At this time, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Doomsday Clock, they are worried at the potential of nuclear holocaust at a worse. They are more worried about it now than they have ever been at any other point in the history of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists because of these three flashpoints, because of great power conflict between Russia, China, the U.S. Gone are the days of the Cold War, where at least during the Cold War, yes, it was great power conflict, but there was a in the later part of the Cold War, a whole infrastructure between Kennedy and Reagan, even, of nuclear nonproliferation, dialogue, rapprochement, diplomacy, detente between the great powers. So while the great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, might have been fighting little proxy wars for different geostrategic control over different regions of the world, that was why it was called a Cold War, even though there's a lot of hot wars, Korea, Vietnam, Angola. I mean, come on, story for another time, right? There was this infrastructure that kept the balance of power from spiraling into a nuclear conflict. Now we have even more flashpoints between even more powers, Iran, China, Russia. Not saying Brazil is part of this, but we are moving into a multipolar world with nuclear armed powers, and the waning American empire is desperately trying to hold on to its geopolitical power around the world. And these flashpoints are extremely dangerous, and any one flashpoint is extremely dangerous, right? Good example, Cuban Missile Crisis almost ended the whole world in nuclear holocaust over a showdown over some boats and some missiles, right? We have 3 of those going on right now. 3 main ones right now. Plus the ongoing, beef between Iran and Pakistan. That is always, that's a whole other discussion for another time. But that's always a constant threat of nuclear holocaust. So we have all of these flashpoints. The U.S. isn't even talking to Russia. I don't even think they are, back during the Cold War, there was like that red phone, right? Like that kind of classic Tinker Tailor soldier spy movie, red phone. President gets on. Khrushchev, we got to figure this out. That no longer exists. American diplomats and Russian diplomats are not talking. I don't even think they're talking behind third-party proxies. I don't even think they're doing. I don't think they are. That's where we've gotten with this, despite Russia's attempts to treat through multiple third parties, Turkey, China, all these other people trying to do arbitration, and on top of that, no diplomacy, no dialogue. There is no longer internationally enforced anti-nuclear proliferation infrastructure. It's all gone. That is an extremely terrifying prospect, right? So for all this reason, guys, this is why we're at 90 seconds to midnight. To put that into context of how close that is, I have this other article here, also from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, saying, remembering the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a showdown between the U.S., Cuba, Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had put nuclear weapons into Cuba, very close to the U.S. That's fucking scary for anybody in the U.S., but particularly the deep state of the United States, right? Soviet Union had put nuclear warheads into Cuba, pointing them at the eastern coast of the United States. Scary shit. Now, historically in the West, the Soviet Union gets blamed for that. What they never tell you is that the U.S. had put missiles in Turkey, which is extremely close to Soviet. I mean, it's even it's about the same distance between Cuba and the United States. So a year or two prior, don't quote me on the timeline, a year or two prior, though, I believe, the U.S. had put warheads into Turkey. And so responding to that, again, Russia never escalates. I mean, if you actually go back and study history, Russia has only ever responded to escalations by the West. I'm not going to give you a whole spiel on that. Go read your fucking history book. I don't have time. We're already going long. Anyway, so the Soviet Union responded by putting to the warheads in Turkey. They responded to that by putting warheads in Cuba. Oh, my gun's bigger, right? So you have that. And then there was this big showdown because the U.S. government found out about the missiles, and then Soviet ships were coming, and the U.S. did a blockade, not just an embargo, Cuba, a blockade, and there was like ships coming, and apparently everyone's hands was on the keys and the button, and holy shit, like it's gonna happen. Big scary ass moment until it was resolved by some decent statesmen, Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. We don't have anything like that anymore, unfortunately. Anyway, all that is to say, that little quick history lesson is to say, to put in context of how close the world was. I described that situation. That's close. That's fucking scary, right? So we're going to read a little bit of this. Yet in October 1962, the Bulletin's Doomsday Clock remained unchanged. It stood at 7 minutes to midnight in the following year. In 1963, the clock's hand moved to 12 minutes to midnight. So when the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty went into effect. Okay. That is widely considered one of the closest moments we have gotten to nuclear holocaust in history. Fucking close as hell. At that time, it was 7 minutes to midnight. And their hands were on the key. Now, due to all of these flashpoints, due to the lack of infrastructure, due to the lack of diplomacy, due to the fact that the U.S. empire is backed into a corner, it feels like, because it's waning empire, because it's full of Nepo babies and fucking Neros and Caligulas, right? Instead of Augustus. Anyway. Due to those points, the atomic clock is at 90 seconds to midnight. That is pretty fucking telling of how far we are against the edge. A little more here, guys. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for all its potential and ultimate destruction, only lasted a few weeks. However, lessons were quickly apparent when the United States and the Soviet Union installed their first hotline between the two capitals to improve communications. And, of course, negotiated the 1963 Test Ban Treaty, ending all atmospheric nuclear testing. Others have suggested that the gravity of the Cuban Missile Crisis has been defined by decades of scholarship, but that in 1962, the world population to a large degree was unaware. So key points there. The reason why it wasn't that close, despite how close it actually was, is the willingness of dialogue. We no longer have that. We have two nuclear-armed powers that are capable of annihilating all life on Earth. Not even talking to each other, and that's fucking scary. I was going to go into some of these other aspects here, guys, but we're already running longer. And that's okay. Talking about the dangers of AI, biological threats, climate change, all very fascinating stuff. You can check out the article here. Just go to a Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and Google. But I want to touch on a couple other things before we go, revolving around the conflict in Ukraine, right? And the threat of nuclear war. So I just want to leave y'all with this. You see movies and television and stuff, and nuclear war is scary, right? And I should have pulled up a resource on this, but even if there's a limited nuclear war, atomic war, where only a few dozen bombs on a few dozen cities or military installations are dropped, experts that have mapped this have talked about within like 72 hours, 90% of human beings are dead. That's like 7.5 billion people, or more, probably 8. Yeah. Within 72 hours, almost everyone on the planet Earth is dead. That is men, that is women, that is children, that is pregnant mothers. Okay, just instantly killed in nuclear holocaust, evaporated into dust, burnt to death by nuclear fallout. And then you have the nuclear fallout that spreads all over the world, blanketing it in radioactive material that will cause all kinds of cancers, birth defects, mutation, horrifying stuff. It will irradiate farmland for generations. But perhaps the even scarier part of that, if that's even possible, is what happens as a result of the detonations. Is if you detonate a nuclear bomb in major cities, everything that's destroyed burns. Buildings, people, farmland, it all burns and dumps particulates into the atmosphere. And they talk about, even in a nuclear war, so many particulates would be dumped into the atmosphere that it would essentially black out the sun. And that would cause something called nuclear winter, where for 3 years, they say, there would be so much particulates in the atmosphere that the sun would not shine. And it would cause mass crop failure, and then a further 9%, whatever remains from the detonations, will perish due to famine. That is worse, more terrifying, more poignant of an image of hell than anything depicted in any religious scripture anywhere on the planet. And that is where we are at geostrategically. And I am not going to blame Russia for it. You want to understand why I don't want to blame Russia for it? I don't justify great power conflict on any end. But their reasons for going into Ukraine were legitimate concerns that could have been alleviated if the U.S. was not a hegemonic empire, hell-bent not only on controlling some powers of empire, but dominating all of the human species. So when it comes to the potential of nuclear holocaust, the only entity on the planet you should be blaming is the United States ruling class. The United States capitalist class, the United States political class, the United States military class. It is a handful. It's not even the Russian ruling class. It really is not. And there's historic precedent for that read a fucking book. It is a handful of ultra wealthy sociopaths in the United States empire that are saying we would rather end all humanity in a holocaust beyond our comprehension than not only lose our empire, but even lose a fraction of a percentage point of our empire's power. And I know this is terrifying and scary and holy shit, Dylan's gone full doomer. No, I haven't. I want to point out the reason why we ended up with a Cold War that did not end in nuclear holocaust, the reason why we ended up with all sorts of detente and non-nuclear proliferation infrastructure isn't because politicians alone had cooler heads. That helped in some of the hot moments. It was because people got out into the street and protested their governments and shut shit down and said, you are not going to end our species in a nuclear holocaust. And that mobilization of the working class is what led to the infrastructure, and I would argue is what kept us from nuclear annihilation. So remember, despite dealing with literally the godlike powers of empire, you have power too, and it lies in joining hands, joining arms with your fellow working class people and shutting down a system that is dedicated not just to war, not just to empire, but to the annihilation of everything that is human. But anyway, guys, that's all I have for you. It felt good to get back into the studio. I still must have it, guys, because I said it was going to be a 5-10 minute video, but here I am 30 minutes later. I appreciate you guys sitting with me. I really hope I can start fitting this into my life again and putting out more content for you guys, because I miss it, and I know my voice, however small, however few people listen to it, is still a voice for change. And I owe it to my fellow working class brothers and sisters to add that voice into the mix. So hoping to keep this going, guys. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to subscribe. Drop comments, all of that. I did get a notification recently that my videos on Facebook are now being monetized. So if you want to start watching it on there rather than on YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube right now, that would be greatly appreciated. Don't forget you can support me with one-time donations through PayPal at paypal.me/entitledmillennials. You can donate on Patreon at patreon.com/entitledmillennials. You guys know all that. And, as always, I love hanging out with you guys. I love talking the issues with you. And I look forward to talking with you all again real soon.
I wanna start a revolution.